So it's been a time of great turbulence in the India-US relationship. You have a trade deal that happens to be stuck. You have President Trump just now, in fact, minutes before this interview began, talking about India purchasing Russian oil, selling it for big profits, and not caring how many people died in the Ukraine war. An increasing level of tension and acrimony now reflecting in the India-US relationship. So the big question that leaves us with is, where do we go from here? Joining us to decode all of that is Rick Rossow of the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He holds the India chair at CSIS and is really one of the best known experts on the Indian economy. Rick, thank you so much for joining us. Could you tell us a little bit about where we are right now in the India-US relationship? We've seen a lot of tweets, a lot of talk about this trade agreement, Trump tariffs. Could you help us make sense of it all?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. Certainly, the administration came out of the gates pretty strong and bullish on India. You saw the Quad foreign ministers meeting, including Minister Jaishankar, as the first foreign policy meeting. Prime Minister Modi was one of the first foreign leaders invited to the White House. Obviously, President Trump continues to say that India is tough on tariffs and tough on trade, but the promise to negotiate a bilateral trade agreement, felt like the first few months out of the gates pretty strong. And that continues what we saw during Trump's last administration and successive administrations, dating back at least, I would say, to President Clinton, although certainly with some occasional patches of wobbliness. But yeah, the last month and a half, two things have really served to intervene in what had been a relatively high level of bonhomie. The first, of course, is President Trump's claims about the role that he played in negotiating the settlement between India and Pakistan, which India strongly disputes the version of events that President Trump has attempted to claim credit for. And then the second is the failure to get past the last minute negotiations in getting this first iteration of a U.S.-India bilateral trade agreement. And those two things have really caused a lot of chaos. And lately, you've had other things brought in, as you rightly mentioned, including India's continued purchases of Russian oil, which wasn't really a big case that President Trump made early on, since it looked like he was getting relatively friendly towards Russia and towards Putin. So providing a lot of very interesting hurdles for India to try to jump over to keep this relationship as stable as possible, because DC is creating as many waves as they can for what's happening in Delhi.
Right. Could you tell us a little bit about, let me just start with the tariffs and the economic side of the picture, right? 25% tariff. President Trump just minutes ago, as I was saying that he would be substantially raising the tariff on India. It's already been commented on that one of the things that Indian industry was looking at was what is the tariff rate levied on competitor countries like Bangladesh, Vietnam, and so on. And those countries have lower tariffs than we do. And of course, with this additional Russia penalty, that tariff of 25% is likely to get bumped up again. So where does that leave India, in this Asian competition to develop itself? How do the tariffs impact Indian industry?
Well, I think it's important to remind ourselves that India is primarily a services-driven economy for economic growth, and it's an agriculture economy in terms of employment. So when you think about the impact in India, it's always important to start that point. Sometimes we think that manufacturing is the core of what an economy is. It's not, certainly not for India and not for the United States. The second, most of India's growth path is going to be driven more by the decisions India takes than a trade agreement. If India were to initiate more reforms, bring foreign investment in, help unleash the dynamic entrepreneurial spirits that we know India has and is seen in many sectors that were deregulated. And a lot of that work has got to be done by state government. So again, a lot of India's commercial destiny does not lie in a trade agreement and does not lie with Washington. It lies with decisions that have to be taken in India to improve and reform the economy. So that's always a good starting point. This is not everything on the table. This is an important slice that's on the table right now when we talk about this. I do think at the end of the day, the fact that the White House, the administration, does not have a lot of long-term experienced India hands. When India says trade agreement opening up areas like basic products of agriculture is a political no-go, sometimes people that may not understand how important agriculture is for people that don't have a lot of other economic options in India, that this really is a political bright line, that is not a negotiating ploy. And I think that's what's been really difficult to try to get Washington, the Trump administration to understand, is there are political bright lines that politically cannot be crossed. So we're continuing to squeeze to try to get market access in areas that I don't think can be granted under any circumstance. You're not going to risk your government for a trade agreement where the economic impact could be devastating for a lot of workers. So the question is the United States going to blink, or are we going to continue circling at the point that we are that we're at right now? And that's where I think we're stuck, and I don't know what the impasse is going to be.
Could you tell us a little bit about that question? We've sort of talked about uh, the sense that, you've heard this perhaps here in DC as well, that a phone call between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump could help sort out the issue. Is this really an issue that two leaders sitting together can sort out, that Prime Minister Modi can sit down with President Trump and explain to him what the difficulties are here?
You'd like to think so. But the question is, does President Trump trust Prime Minister Modi enough? Where if Modi were to say, we've reached the end of the line, we can't put anything more on the table in these few sticky areas, agriculture, it sounds like still some concerns about American dairy products, which has got some religious, cultural, obviously resonance behind it. And so can that be handled through a phone call? Maybe potentially it can. But I don't think anybody that attempts to be in the business of predicting what President Trump's reaction is going to be to anything that crosses his table, that there's a lot of merit to that. We don't know which way the president's going to zig or zag next, and which phone call he's going to respond to favorably, and which one might drive him further in a corner. Is he going to think this is another negotiating ploy and turn up the heat a little bit more? So ordinarily, you'd think that would be helpful right now. A little bit less so because nobody can predict the president's next moves.
Right. Could you tell us a little bit about sort of the political picture that's sort of being painted right now? We've already talked about how we've seen these statements come out from President Trump in the last couple of days, sort of really taking on India in many ways. We've seen the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller. All of them have come out with statements that seem to be very coordinated in the sense to put pressure on India, either to change its policies on trade or so on and so forth. And that has caused an enormous backlash here in India. Lots of people really taking exception to the way America is sort of publicly taking these disputes into social media and so on. What does that mean for the political atmosphere? Does that make it harder and harder to the two sides to get a deal done in the next couple of days and weeks if the political atmosphere remains the way it is right now?
Yeah, I think the Modi government and Prime Minister Modi himself has been very pragmatic, considering the number of barbs that President Trump hurled at India last time that the Trump administration was in office, and yet the two leaders would still get together at roadshows in Texas and Gujarat and still be good friends, standing on stage. It tells me that India can put up with a lot of this kind of pressure, but again, to ask India to cross political thresholds that are impossible to be crossed and stay in office, is going to be a bridge too far. So I think India can handle the verbal pressure as long as a deal does come across that is politically palatable. I think there's also, to some level, an understanding that, President Trump's not wrong in some of what he's saying. India, under Prime Minister Modi, has been very protectionist. You've seen tariff rates, especially in the Modi government's first term, increase pretty dramatically. Domestic sourcing rules, as well as other standards issues that have made it hard for American companies to access the market. So a lot of the market access issues that President Trump has in mind are quite real, and they have gotten worse in recent years. But also on the upside, I mean, the prize for having a stronger economic relationship too, it's impossible to ignore. What you see today, India, the most populous country in the world, the fastest growing large economy, about to jump over Japan and Germany to be the world's third largest economy. If President Trump is able to push and get additional market access, the prize for American companies on being able to further expand economic integration with India, is really kind of tremendous. So between protectionism and the upside of the future we all see for India, there's a reason why it's gotten more attention than a lot of smaller countries have.
Right. Could you tell us a little bit about what are the consequences if the deal falls through? I've spoken to some people here who said it would be a mistake. The deal that India has offered is substantial, that there are concessions in that deal that the US Trade Representative, for example, Jameson Greer, reportedly is happy with. What happens if that deal does not come through? Because we saw Goldman Sachs put out a report today where they said that, in fact, they would be lowering their estimate for India's growth projections because precisely of the uncertainty generated by these clashes with President Trump. What are the consequences if the deal doesn't go through?
Yeah, I mean, if nothing else changes in India, the economic relationship with the United States is incredibly important. We're the largest export market for goods by far. India exports twice as much to the United States as India exports to any other country. We're the largest export market for services, the largest source of foreign investment. I know technically Mauritius and Singapore rate a little bit higher, but if you look through the tax treaty status, the United States is right there. So keeping a robust relationship alive is very important. And goods exports is obviously a significant thing for Indian companies to think about and consider. The question about what it means for India, really, as I kind of alluded to earlier, is this going to trigger some more introspection? Is India going to look to sign, as they've been doing, trade agreements with other partners and start to work around the United States rather than channeling a lot of its trade and investment relations with the United States? And is India going to dig in a little bit more deeply on domestic reforms? You didn't see a lot of big reforms in Modi's second term. You've seen none so far, a little over a year into the third term. And the question is, if they can't get a deal with the United States and you want to see that economic momentum, most of the tools for making that happen are in the government's hands. Now, I know it's easy if you're in Washington to say, like, just do all these reforms. I mean, there's political price to be paid. But if that political price is less than negotiating agriculture market access with the United States, and the economic impact for a lot of those changes in terms of employment growth and exports growth is going to be a lot higher. So yeah, the impact if this deal falls through and nothing else changes is going to be bad for India. If this falls through, India signs other deals and or India initiates domestic reforms, this could be a point of introspection when India really begins to take off.
It's also been suggested that because trade is one of the key issues that President Trump really cares about, there is that risk that what starts in trade could affect the other aspects of the relationship as well. We're of course just a couple of months away from President Trump's scheduled visit to come to India for the Quad Leaders Summit. Has been the sense, at least you may have heard it, I've certainly heard it sitting here in DC, that there is a real risk that he does not show up for that summit if India does not sign a trade deal and if he's bashing India for buying Russian energy. Your sense of that issue, that if you don't get the trade deal done, it also impacts other sides of the relationship, strategic cooperation, technology, defense, and so on.
Not getting the trade agreement done by itself, I think we can still make progress in other areas, but not getting a trade agreement and seeing some of the rhetoric the White House has put out in recent days on Pakistan, on India's relations with Russia, that could be detrimental. You also see, other impacts. For instance, I mean, it looks like you're going to have a dramatic drop in the number of Indian students coming here, less interest in Indian tech workers on coming and working in the United States. And those people-to-people ties, which have been so fundamentally important for making this relationship solid and robust, even when our political leaders haven't felt as good about working with each other, that's an important underpinning where it's also because of some of these anti-immigration announcements and policies have really started to bleed in as well. So you've actually got a kind of a full frontal assault right now on some of the core areas that have been really cementing the U.S.-India partnership. Because, again, government-to-government relations are nice, but it's not the biggest thing. It's not the only thing, and certainly not the biggest thing. Companies take their own decisions on where they're going to have trade and investment flows coming from. Students decide where they're going to go, and those things it's bleeding over into not just what the governments are thinking, but to what companies are thinking, to what the citizens are thinking about where they want to study and work. That's the areas that I'm a little bit more concerned about, than maybe the deal itself happening or not happening.
Right. And could you tell us a little bit about sort of the reforms picture that you were painting? What exactly would you like to see? Let me start, in fact, by asking you about what India has been trying to do in terms of getting companies to come to manufacture in India. There's been a lot of conversation in India recently, the sense that Vietnam certainly has taken a lot of the investment that was coming out of China. India has in some high-profile cases like Apple, but there's a sense that we haven't done as well as we could have. So could I ask you that question? How do those tariffs, the fact that India's tariffs will probably be higher than a lot of other Asian countries, how does that impact companies or wanting to come to India, build and manufacture in India? How does that impact India's aspirations that way?
Yeah, union government policies have a modest but important impact on whether India becomes that global manufacturing hub. And you're right, the main policy lever that the union government holds that impacts the manufacturing ecosystem is going to be tariffs. Can you bring input goods in for less than it costs to import finished products? The government's been talking for years about a dramatic reorganization about how it handles customs duties. This whole idea of duty inversion, where it's cheaper to bring in finished goods than it is to bring in the pieces and do the assembly and manufacture locally. So trade policy has an impact on the manufacturing ecosystem. But frankly, like the reason companies aren't showing up in droves yet, India is pulling in $50 billion in foreign investment annually. That's bigger than it was before Modi came to office, but well below the $100+ billion that China was bringing in when it first started to hit the road and really attracting a lot of global manufacturing. And for there, most of the features of the manufacturing environment that continue to deter investors in a bigger way are basic areas of infrastructure that are controlled by state governments. It's very hard to get quality electric power, reliable electric power at good rates. Land acquisition still remains a very corrupt part of doing business in India to acquire land and be able to clear that, getting access to water and sanitation, labor regulations. So a lot of these issues that actually are outside the Modi government's direct purview, things that state governments control. Today you've only got a handful of states, I think, that wake up every day and worry and think about how they can land those investments. It's the exception rather than the norm. And if you have a few more big states really starting to improve some of the local business environment conditions, then I think India becomes much more competitive versus the big manufacturing economies.
So, Rick, let me just close off with this question then. How confident are you personally? I hate to ask you to indulge in crystal ball gazing, but how confident are you personally that the two sides will be able to sort this issue out over the next couple of weeks? Because again, the tariff deadline for India, the tariffs kick in on August 7th. So, what do you think?
Yeah, I don't think they'll have a deal necessarily before then, but a
Mhm.
deal before the president's trip. I'd say my confidence level is above 50%.
Mhm.
I still think there's a will to do it. I think the fact that the president is spending this much time on social media complaining about India,
Mhm.
shows that they really do view the prize and the breakthrough opportunity. But you've got to see the White House blink on some of the areas that really are political no-go areas. So I'd say I'd put it a little above 50% that it happens, between now and the fall, but not much above 50%.
Understood.
If we continue throwing acrimony on top of this, and India's signing deals and working on economic relations with other countries, maybe they decide that's the best pathway to go because they can never potentially please the White House. But right now, I still think we have above 50% because they've gotten so far down the road and there's so much attention on it. Hopefully, we don't break that opportunity through a couple of ill-timed social media hits.
Right. Actually, Rick, you saying that I think brought something up. There was a sense, I think the former Finance Secretary of India, Subhash Garg, basically said this on a podcast recently. I was intrigued by it. He said that, frankly, we should just walk away because we can't give the Americans what the White House wants. We can't give them. And what the Americans seem to want in terms of the President Trump made some headlines in India when he said, I want an Indonesia style deal, which is basically goods coming from India to America face a tariff, but American goods going into India face no tariff. He basically said that that's not good. That's a no-go. We can't give the Americans what they wanted. Rather than do a bad deal, we should just do no deal. We should walk away and wait out President Trump and until the 2026 midterms. Your sense of that thinking?
Well, helpfully, I'm sure it's going to be more kind of one-sided the way that it's portrayed. But hopefully, a lot of what the United States produces are not the same things India produces. And so if a lot of what we want to export in terms of goods, in terms of electronics and capital equipment, the things that we make with that still you don't have a lot of industry in India, India's got a higher degree of comfort. They lose some money from tax revenue on tariffs for sure, but you're just kind of swapping out American product from the products of others, including a lot of times China. And so there's a security reason why bringing some stuff in from the United States at a low or zero tariff rate might actually be okay. But that's different than when you're actually going to be bringing in American product that competes with Indian companies that are taking off, growing, including in agriculture. So I think there are a lot of product areas where a more one-sided deal would be okay because we're not swapping out Indian manufacturing. We're just bringing in stuff that you buy from other places. But if you're swapping out, that's when I think it gets a little bit more tricky, and the one-sidedness can't be as deep.
Understood, Rick. Thank you so much. In fact, I was reading a piece of analysis basically saying that, President Trump, this is how he does business, which is that he puts piles and piles pressure on and on and on. And then once the deal is signed, he's all friendship and handshakes. And yes, I love India. India's a great country. I love India. So hopefully that's the way it plays out and the India-US relationship stabilizes after a period of time. But Rick, thank you so much for your time this morning, sitting down with us and explaining to our viewers here at HD what the state of play is in the India-US economic relationship. Thank you.
Thank you for having me on NXT. I appreciate it.